I'm back. I think I'm back. Oh my gosh, you guys. Uh, I hope people are still here. I hope you're still here. Um yeah, my electricity took a dive. It's very windy here. Okay. So Drew's still here, Robin's still here, Marianne is still here. There were about 7 people here before my electricity died. So, I hope they'll get back. Um, it is not that cold here, but for some reason it is very windy here. So I am so sorry. I didn't realize that this might have been a problem. Um, Boo hiss. What a pain in the rear. Okay. I'm just gonna keep moving. Keep moving. All right. So what I was showing as the electricity went out was this picture of Kate and Joel Kopp of American Hurrah. And you can see, I mean, it's not a super great picture because it's black and white and it's 1971, 72. But you can see they're fairly young. I sort of didn't expect that when I saw pictures of them. So anyway, cross your fingers, everybody. I'm going to start reading. Okay, so American Hurrah. Hurrah to Joel and Kate Kopp, who were dedicated quilt lovers long before quilts became the in thing. Thanks to a lot of publicity given to quilt shows and quilt makers during the last year or two, quilts have become a hot item among dealers and collectors. Remember, this is 1972. It's not even we're still 4 years away from the bicentennial. The Kopps recognized artistic merit of quilts more than 5 years ago when they were on their first buying trip for the antique shop they planned to open, called American Hurrah. Kate Kopp says, I'm a graduate of the Parsons School of Design in Fashion and Textile, so a perfect education to get involved in quilts. And after Joel and I married, we got interested in the antique business, so we both left our jobs to open a shop. The first trip out buying, I saw a quilt, and it was love at first sight. They offered antique quilts in their shop from its opening and began specializing in them 3 years ago. So 1969 is when they started specializing, and it was 2 years before that that they started their antique business. So that, this is the late 60s. They were ahead of the wave, I think, for all of this. They believe they have the most complete range of American quilts to be found anywhere. I would say if they're not the most complete, they were pretty darn close, right? And that theirs is the only shop of its kind in the world. There were other dealers, but because I never went to any of these places, I mean, and some of them were still around, within the last few years. I know Laura Fisher was a big dealer in New York. She actually passed away, and so and I don't know if she had a shop up to that point or if it was like, one of those by appointment only situations, like a studio. But nonetheless, like this probably at this time, certainly it was very, very unique. There wasn't this kind of thing out there. They handle antique quilts only, those made prior to 1930, and have at least 300 in stock at all times. Their stock constantly turns over, but they always have on hand quilts in king size, queen size, doubles, and singles, matching sets of twin size quilts in silks and velvets, as well as many unfinished quilt tops. Their quilts range in price from $25 to $150, with an average at about $85. This is 1972. The Kopps travel all over the U.S. to find their quilts. People write to tell them of private sales, auctions, estate sales, and many people bring quilts to their shop for them to see. They have tried buying quilts by mail, but find it too difficult to be sure of the age of a quilt without examining it. How many people have bought something off of eBay and found out, no, indeed, it was not antique. It is not anything like what you thought it was because, without being able to touch it. Kate Kopp has examined thousands of quilts, has read every available book, and she knows prints from her training in textile design. She says, I can tell within 10 years the age of a quilt. There are prints that are very indicative of certain decades, and it is basically a process of elimination. Many quilts are made up of generations of fabrics, and then I use the latest one to date it. So that has been the standard, like always, I think in quilt study, is that a quilt is dated by the last, the newest fabric in it, because obviously you can't look at the oldest fabric because the quilt's not that old. It's got newer fabrics. So like, duh, right? But I think sometimes people don't think about that. And, if they can't identify the newest fabric, they try to go by what they do know, and they may be misstating a quilt. I would not mistake a new quilt for an old one, but many people do because they don't really look at the fabrics closely. Also, the workmanship of older quilts is generally much finer. If you are interested in antique quilts, the Cops invite you to their shop at 316 East 70th Street in New York City. Now, from what I understand, if I remember correctly, having read another article about them, I think they moved a couple times. I think they started off in one location and then they moved maybe a couple times. And if you think about, if you've been to New York and you think about like what some of these kind of places are, it seems to me that they may have been sort of in a place that was kind of had low ceilings, like kind of a small sort of thing. It may have been a sort of a long kind of store. So, not like these bright, beautiful kind of quilt shops and things that we see today. If you live too far away to visit them personally, but still want to shop for quilts, the Cops suggest that you watch your local papers for advertisements of estate sales and auctions. A note on the bulletin board of your church might also yield a quilt or two. If you are lucky enough to find an antique quilt for under $100, you will have found yourself a real bargain. The Cops believe that quilting is a true American folk art. Kate says when you buy a good old quilt, you're getting a legitimate piece of 19th century art. And for $100, that's a steal. So, yeah, and they show, there's a picture here. I don't think it's a clear enough picture, so I don't know if you can really see this very well. But it's talking about their store window. I guess it's the store window. It has all this early Americana stuff. So, but yeah, they were, just from what I could read and reading into it, certainly, they went out of business. I'm not sure when. I'm not sure when they went out of business, and I'm not sure why. But I suspect that some of my friends who have been in the industry much longer than me probably have the answer to that. But aside from that, they seemed like they were very generous, and giving permission for their quilts to be shown a lot of places. So I'm really fascinated by them, and I really want to learn more about them. Just kind of judging by, when they got married and when they started selling antiques / quilts, and, based on, she had gone to school. I don't know about him, but I would guess they'd probably be in their 80s today if they are both still alive. I don't know. That is something I want to find out. So if anybody knows, tell me. And if not, I'm gonna start bugging people that know these things. All right. Now on to the article that I really, really, really wanted to read you guys. And this is from week before last. When we looked at these, I knew we wouldn't have enough time to look at this. So that is why I have brought us back. Okay. So as you remember, this is December 1973. The block that's on the front cover is one of Bonnie Lehman did this Christmas memory quilt sort of thing where every year they're releasing a block, and you can mail order the older blocks. There came a point where they're not showing these blocks in the magazine, best as I can tell. There's a handful of them from the early 70s that you can see that they kind of repeat, showing the little clipping. But I think it's just like you had to mail order these. They were not printed in the magazine with instructions, with the exception of this one. I think this one was. I think. Let me flip here very quick. Actually, it may not have been. I may have that wrong. Yeah, I think I'm wrong about that. The instructions are not printed in here. They were always a mail order situation. So, okay. So there's a couple of things in here I wanted to read. One is really fascinating because it's a historical thing, and then the other one is this Sally Garrett article. So let's read the Sally Garrett first, and then I will read you this other one that has some kind of interesting information that I had never heard about quilts, or some terminology that was new to me. So this is called The Elusive English Quilt by Sally Garrett. December 1973, Quilters Newsletter. Late in the spring of 1973, my friend Lou Norton and I went innocently in search of patchwork quilts in Great Britain. I had done a fair amount of homework, reading up on museums and craft centers, getting names and addresses from friends, writing ahead to museums and textile authorities, so I felt fairly well prepared. And let me stop there to mention, Sally Garrett is the founder of American Quilt Study Group. She did not found that organization for another 10 years, 11 years. 1984? Oh my gosh, now I'm thinking I might have the date wrong. It's the 80s. She's writing in a Quilters newsletter long before she starts AQSG is the point I'm trying to make. So that is something I didn't realize about her. I've heard the stories about how she got interested in quilts. She was not a quilter. She did go to school. I think she worked on her master's throughout the time period that she was, starting up AQSG. But she did printmaking. And I actually own a few of her prints that she created from photographs, and she printed them on fabric. And I own a few of them. I got them at auction, and I donated some of them to the Quilters Hall of Fame, their museum. So anyway, I digress. So she feels fairly well prepared going to Great Britain. But alas, I was prepared to look for something which doesn't exist, or at least not exactly. Patchwork quilts in Great Britain and in America were once very similar. Ideas, designs, fabrics, and the finished quilts themselves were carried both ways across the Atlantic in years past. Museums have old quilts brought home from America, which look very much like some British quilts of that period. As time went on, however, and the United States became less of a colony in all its ideas, the patchwork quilt evolved differently in the two nations. So it's no use trying to find a contemporary American-type patchwork quilt in Great Britain. The women there are doing something different. And I mean, I think we figured this out. In reading Mavis Fitz-Randolph was our most recent Great Britain read. We read Avril Colby a while back, and I have my next Avril Colby to read you guys. We talked about Elizabeth Hake. We have not read her book yet, but we're getting to it. So we've kind of already seen this. Like there is that point where U.S. and Great Britain greatly diverge from what they're doing. One major difference is that in Britain, patchwork and quilting have become almost totally divorced. One may find patchwork being done on things from the size of tea cozies to bedspreads, but it is almost never quilted or even padded. One might also find quilting being done, but nearly always on plain fabric. Another difference, which is more difficult to describe, is that in Great Britain, both quilting and patchwork appear to be more of a derivative of fine needlework and more closely related to embroidery than in the United States, where they are more closely related to sewing. The object in the British Isles seems to be to see how fine and neat the stitches can be made, with somewhat less attention to design. The women we met were politely horrified at the idea of using a sewing machine at all. Most of the contemporary patchwork is either all hexagons, paper piecing, right? Or a combination of hexagons and diamonds. Most of these are made by basting the patches over a paper pattern and overcasting the edges together with many tiny stitches. Some patchwork we saw was made of hexagonal pieces no larger than a dime. Oh my gosh, that's like a half inch. I think that's like a half-inch hexie. Several women mentioned their distress at not being able to find size 100 thread anymore for the fine stitching of patchwork. size 100. I think the only size 100 thread I've ever stitched was silk, and silk thread can get like smaller than the size of a human hair. Now the only cotton thread, the smallest cotton thread or the thinnest cotton thread I've ever used was 80. And you just look at that and it'll break. Like, and it is for applique. It's usually because it'll sink down into the fabric. You won't be able to see it. Um, but you have to just use short lengths of it, because if you try to be economical and use like a long piece of it, it's gonna break before you even get, you know, 4 or 5 inches down. So yeah, 100, size 100 thread. That is insane to me. Assuming that they're talking about cotton and not silk. An important consideration in patchwork is the precise cutting of the patches. A great many floral prints are used, with a flower being carefully positioned in the patch so that when the work is complete, it is almost as though another single fabric has been designed and created. So she's talking about fussy cutting. And, I've seen fussy cutting in antique quilts here, but it does seem to be something, especially because they were doing the English paper piecing over there in Great Britain, which I assume they just call it paper piecing. Versus English paper piecing. I don't know. In any event, they do kind of have a different eye for what they're working on. The colors used are frequently rather somber. I don't agree with that. And the final effect is one of considerable formality. As the patchwork is not to be quilted or tied, but only tacked occasionally to a lining, it is probably necessary to use a very firm fabric and to stitch the patches together very firmly, so there is no chance of a seam pulling out or stretching. 40 overcast stitches per inch would not be surprising here. That's a lot. And you're thinking about, that's an inch, if you could see my hand there. 40 overcast stitches, that is truly a lot. I would say I probably averaged like 10 or 12, for an inch. But then again, I also have quilted the pieces that I've done like that. So quilting, too, in Great Britain is a form of careful, precise needlework. As it is hardly ever done on patchwork or patterned fabric, the quilting design stands entirely on its own. All over designs for bed quilts, stitched in yellow silk on cream linen or silk fabric, were traditional in Durham and Wales and are occasionally still done. Most quilting now, however, is on smaller things such as tea cozies and garments. And if you guys remember, when I went to Birmingham back in the summer, and I went to Festival of Quilts, there was that fantastic Quilters Guild show that had all of the stuff from the war years. And yes, tons of quilted garments. Obviously, the British lost a lot, during the Blitz. They were having trouble with food and with keeping warm, so it's no surprise that they created things that were about warmth, but she's saying here somber. I don't agree with that, because I think, maybe she's talking about some of the Welsh quilts are very navy blue and brown and black and gray. Those were the colors they used, just because it was what was available. But I have seen a lot that I wouldn't think of it as somber. Robin, right? So she's saying Jill had the right idea when she started on her hexies. If you're not on the joke, our friend Jill, I taught her how to do English paper piecing. She had done some before and she wasn't sure if she was doing it right, so I kind of did a tutorial for her. And girlfriend probably puts 300 stitches per inch in the overcasting. I promise you it's not going to come apart if you reduce that number. But yes, 40 little overcast stitches per inch is just insanely a lot. So Jill would have fit right in with these people. As these pieces of needlework are not intended to be washed, the design is never penciled on, but is impressed on the fabric with an awl. So that's that, you're just kind of scratching it over, kind of like you do it with your fingernail too. That is actually how I often mark my stuff, because I don't love marking pens. Sometimes I'll use chalk, like a chalk marking pen, but otherwise I've seen so many quilts, including mine, the markings not come out very well, especially for things that you can't wash. So I like that idea of marking with an awl, although I think an awl is probably too pointy. You can kind of rip your threads a little bit if you're not careful. They make something now called a Hera marker, and it is a piece of plastic, like a plastic pen like thing that it like looks like a little sort of blade, and you just sort of run it along a ruler, and it, you know, it'll make a line, and it's just kind of compressing the fabric a little bit. So it never really occurred to me that the British were doing that, although I do know. I think Mavis Fitz Randolph, I think in her step by steps, she did talk about that, about using like a fingernail or an awl to mark instead of a pen or something. Most quilting is done with a fine running stitch, but sometimes when a garment will be lined or the back of the work will not be seen, as in a pillow top, a back stitch is used. Okay, here I have to kind of disagree with Sally Girt again. The back stitch was used extensively in Welsh quilting. Now, perhaps she wasn't in that part of the country viewing those quilts extensively, but we do know that antique Welsh quilts, a lot of them use back stitching. So yeah, it's not just when it's not seen. Other kinds of quilting practiced are 3 varieties of linen quilting. Stuffed quilting, which we usually call trapunto, running quarter yarn between 2 lines of quilts. I think she means between lines of quilting. And cord quilting, where only 1 layer of linen is used with a cord firmly stitched to the back with a herringbone stitch, giving a raised design on the front. That is interesting because I had not seen something like that in a quilt. Interesting. Well, now wait a minute. What she's talking about here? Right, Sally Garut. She says other kinds of quilting practice are 3 varieties of linen quilting: stuffed quilting and cord quilting. Well, that's only 2 varieties, Sally. I think we could have used an editor here. All of these forms of quilting are also in use in the United States. What is different in Britain is that they are, with few exceptions, the only forms used. Some of the finest examples of old quilting can be found in costume museums on the petticoats, which were once an important and visible part of the dress, and in the extraordinarily fine worked gentlemen's waistcoats, which we've seen those, and especially the petticoats. Up in New England, I think there's in the Whaling Museum and Sturbridge Village, there's these just amazing petticoats. And that's what they were quilting here. They did some of those bedspread type of whole cloth things, but these petticoats were really like sort of the original quilted item. And if you haven't seen any of these, like, Google it. Lynn Bassett is a quilt scholar who has done extensive research into this particular set of these quilted petticoats. And I can't remember if she's found, like, I don't know, a whole bunch of them. And she's I think with some of them, she's kind of able to connect, like they were clearly made by the same people or within the same family. Some of them clearly show a ship. Some of them have mermaids and animals, all kinds of stuff. So yeah, this is definitely, not just in the UK, but also here in the US, these costume applications. Curiously, in many of these same garments where the needle, in many of these same garments where the needlework is exquisite, and we need some editing here, the sewing on the garment is wretched. Okay, Sally, tell it like it is. Pieces poorly cut, large stitching, bulky seams, poorly finished edges, and the like. Keeping in mind that clothing which finds its way to museums is more likely to be the clothing of celebrities than of ordinary people, and is therefore more likely to be the finest in material and workmanship. To see such poor sewing in these garments was quite a shock. There seems not to have been a tradition of and value given to plain sewing in Britain, in contrast to that given embroidery and needlework. I think in some ways I kind of I agree with her, because I did study costume long before I was studying quilts. And yes, there is a shocking amount of very poor needlework and construction in clothing. But if you think about it this way, clothing was very, very frequently remade. So they don't want to have, I mean, obviously they want to be sewn in a way that like the garment holds together, but they don't want these meticulous, tiny little infant, like microscopic stitches because they would cut these things apart. So, that might be one where stitches are maybe seem to be sloppy. They would also sew, linings, on the inside and sometimes boning. And sometimes you'll see that stuff is kind of sloppy too. But I think, it's not necessarily through sloppy through the eyes of those contemporary people with these clothing. I think it's us being so used to ready-made garments. You buy a garment today, the seams are going to be overlocked. um there's if it's a quality garment, the seams will be very carefully finished. If you can afford couture, those seams also are typically finished like in very fine ways. So like French seams or Hong Kong seams. And these are where little strips of fabric, almost like a binding, is used to cover those seams. Um, in contrast that to, the mantua makers, the dressmakers, the home sewists back, 19th century, 18th century, their work does probably look a little bit sloppy. Um, so, I mean, I think what she's observing is, yeah. But also I think that, the reasoning behind that you have to take into consideration. Um, so my opinion, perhaps there has perhaps that has some bearing on women in Britain following a needlework tradition when they want to create something beautiful. While in America, where sewing is valued too, women quite comfortably can choose to use a simple running stitch seam to join their patches and to quilt their quilts. Fabrics probably play their part in the difference too. The yardage found in stores suffers generally from the same phenomenon as in the US. Knits are so popular that good, inexpensive cottons are hard to find. And this is something I've kind of been passively studying. The proliferation of polyester and synthetic types of fabrics, like in the post-war years. I mean, this is when we have it just ramps up. And by the 70s, I mean, everybody's wearing, the wash and wear, you don't have to iron it. It's polyester. It never wrinkles. You smell really bad in it if you sweat. I mean, who hasn't had to wear a work uniform or something like, or wore like horrible polyester clothes? I mean, good Lord, the pit stains those things have. So by this point in the 70s, worldwide, everybody's wearing polyester. Um, Many patchworkers use the kind of glazed chintzes and cretones. I can't remember how to pronounce this. Cretones, Cretonnes. Um, it's a specific type of fabric that would be used for draperies and slip covers in America. So I want to say it's like a kind of a nubby kind of nubby's probably the wrong word too. Sort of a crinkly sort of like upholstery, drapery sort of fabric, I think, but it was often seen in quilts. Much care is taken to preserve the glaze. As soon as you wash it, glaze is gone. This kind of fabric produces a weightier, pieced top, and when lined with a fairly heavy fabric, which works well, as it will not be quilted, makes a substantial bed cover. All in all, when studying what people in other cultures are doing with their needles, it is well to keep an open mind. Preconceptions can lead to a lot of frustration. It's disappointing, for instance, to learn that a Welsh quilt nowadays is a woven woolen blanket, not a quilt. But a chance remark by Avril Colby that she stuffs her unique gathered quilting with the sheep's wool that one can pluck off the hedges serves to open our minds to what different sorts of life we all lead and what a pleasure it is to discover it. So that is interesting. I think that, I think in her travels, what Sally Gerd is saying is I think what she observed is absolutely true. I do think that that study of quilting since then, since the 70s, has unearthed, I think, a lot more in the UK. Still certainly very different from what we were doing here. And even today, I think about like French quilts, um, and English quilts. There's lots of, so, the designers in the US definitely, and especially since you can buy so many quilt patterns as PDFs. You just buy them online, you download them, you print them yourself. People all across the world can make a quilt exactly like we make in the US, or exactly like a quilter in Australia makes. So I think that we have a lot more like homogenized quilting today. However, if you look at some of the individual designers, and kind of, where they've maybe had some impact on fellow quilters in their region, you definitely see things that are unique. So Japanese quilting kind of takes on a very specific look. The French quilts also take on that. And I think the French quilts are fascinating because they're just, some of them are just these riots of color and embroidery and all kinds of stuff. Um, and I've seen some Australian quilt designers too. There's a very well-known Australian quilt designer that does English paper piecing, and her stuff is absolutely stunning. I have her paper piecing book. It was purchased as a PDF, because it's easier to get it that way, obviously from Australia. So yeah, I think it's an interesting look at what's happening regionally. Ah, okay. So Robin says, Cretonne is primarily, oh, wait a minute. Oops. That isn't a touch screen. Okay, let's see. So Robin says, Cretonne is a durable, unglazed, heavy cotton or linen fabric known for its colorful prints, often floral, used primarily for home furnishings like curtains, slipcovers, and upholstery, though lighter versions can be used for clothing. It is similar to chintz, but typically duller and stronger, named after a French village. Primarily cotton, sometimes linen or blends. Unglazed, giving it a matte or dull finish. Maybe that's what I'm remembering. Not that it's nubby, but it's like it's sort of flat. Texture is strong, sturdy, and firm with a simple weave. Often features bright printed patterns, especially florals, but can be plain or printed on both sides. That's interesting. I don't know that I've ever seen a fabric that was printed on both sides. Like a reversible fabric. And then it goes on to talk about lighter versions for smocks and children's clothes, but that the heavier ones are for drapery, etc. Okay. Okay, so originally it was a strong white fabric with a hemp warp and a linen weft. Okay. I think what I was envisioning was the wrong thing. I have seen this this definition before. Yeah, this is something that Jill and I talk about a lot. We need to kind of pull together, I think, a glossary of some of these things, and maybe like pictorial examples would be helpful because, for example, plush. That was something that we talked about, and I think I have an example of plush. I have a pincushion and a quilt. It's like a tied. It's an awful thing. It's so ugly, but I think it features plush. That's why I bought it. And plush is different than velvet or velveteen. It just, even though it's kind of fuzzy, it has a nap. It feels different and looks different than velvet. It's longer than velvet. It's sort of sparser than velvet, and it was used in more like upholstery than, say, clothing and other fine goods. Another one is dimity. That one's a very old type of fabric, but I think it's like a basic weave, but then it has other weaving kind of like through it that creates like these raised sections. And I know I've seen it like in person, but I keep thinking like it's one of those fabrics I'd struggle to pick out. I need to see more of it, I think. So Robin is saying the word is now applied to this cotton we talked about, stouter than chintz, but for the same purpose. Frequently, cretonne has a fancy woven pattern of some kind which is modified by the printed design. It is sometimes made with a weft of cotton waste. Okay, so even today it's kind of evolved, maybe. Interesting. Okay. These are the things that I'm frequently like, can I find a piece of it? Can I find a sample of it to like really wrap my head around? I'll have to be out there on the lookout. Okay. let us look at what is next. So this, oh, this one was a fun one. So let's see, which one is this? This is December 1974. Let me find this one so you guys can see. Oh, it was the next picture. Okay. So this is December 1974. This is one of those ones where they still haven't gone to full color yet, but they're also not black and white anymore. It's this weird pink, like, I don't know if you can see it in my window, but it's this weird pale pink that they're able to print with. And so I have no idea what this piece on the front looks like in real life. It may be red and green. I kind of doubt it. It looks like it's probably silk. And then you have this floral, you know, and it looks like it's fairly old. I think these here might be those kind of ombre prints that, you know, they could make pretty early in the 19th century. That surprises me that they had you know, their printing technology was actually prettier and finer than what we can, you know, what we do today. I think sometimes that really surprises me, because you want to think that old things are going to be more primitive, you know, or are just not as fine and detailed, but that couldn't be farther from the truth, I think. So, all right. So this is on page 15. This is, I'm trying to see if this is like a letter to the editor, or exactly what this is. It does not have like a byline, so I'm assuming that it was probably written by Bonnie, or I want to say it was maybe her daughter was involved in the business and wrote for a while. That may be later on, I'm not sure. So anyway, this is how this goes. This is called The Rewards of Sharing. And again, 1974. The Forest Park Civic Association of Springfield, Massachusetts recently sponsored the making and selling of 3 quilts to raise funds for its work. And it looks like, do they have a picture here? Oh, no. 3. Okay, I think we did look at this. Everything that's referenced on this page is not... Okay, it was the wrong page. It's actually page 4. Okay. I did not take a picture of this, but I will hold it up quickly so you can see what these look like. So they're sampler quilts. They look interesting. You know, bummer that it's black and white. Okay, so those, I guess, are 2 of the 3 quilts to raise funds for its work. Forest Park Civic Association. Following is an excerpt from a letter the association sent to the 3 new owners of these quilts. We published this letter in part, hoping it will inspire other neighborhoods and other communities to begin a similar project. Okay, so this is from a letter, and again, I'm assuming this is Bonnie Lehman putting this in here, this first paragraph are her words. So the letter says as follows. To you, the new and proud owner of a Forest Park Civic Association quilt, we wish many, many long years of the warmth and joy such as felt by we who helped make it. Today, the opportunities for people to create together with their hands are often limited. Affluence has brought us unimagined creature comforts, but regrettably, it has taken us away from our handcrafted beginnings. In the memory of very few of us is the picture of neighbors intimately involved in community activities. In the past, roofs were raised, harvests were brought in, quilts were constructed, frequently in true communal atmosphere. Today, we go to a roofer or we go to a chain grocery store to buy shrink-wrapped corn. They had shrink-wrapped corn in 74. Who knew? And we go to a department store to buy an electric blanket. Perhaps we have lost our need to build our own environment and are now content to live specialized lives totally removed from our past. As a result, we are living through increasingly divisive times. You know, I am continually gobsmacked by these kind of comments in here. I mean, I know I read one of Bonnie Lehman's, her editorial letters, I think was from that first one, December 73, the other day. And like, she could have been, I mean, with some exceptions, she could have been writing that letter today, and I'm also seeing this could also be written today. We are living through increasingly divisive times. Family members go their own way, separate from one another. Neighbors cease being neighbors and simply become co-inhabitants of a physical piece of ground. What you now own is a beautiful repudiation of the foregoing statements. What you have in your hands is a quilt that was made as a fundraising project by over 70 Forest Park women who joined hands and hearts and work and lived through a wonderful shared experience. 16-year-old girls quilting next to 70-year-old women, each gaining insight and understanding from each other, understanding from the other, each sharing experiences as equals. These quilting sessions offered us neighborhood women an opportunity to be neighborly in the true old-fashioned sense of the word. Here was a time to discover new friends, develop deeper ties with old friends, and generally give of oneself to others, working toward a shared goal. I love that. I think that's fabulous. Again, like, oh my gosh, think about today, AI, how important handmade stuff is. And I think I think a lot of people understand that, and they feel that. Okay, let us go on to the next one. This one, oh, wait a minute, there's one of them, it might be this next one I'm getting ready to read. There's one that feels like a little bit of an the person's admonishing. Okay, this is November, December 1987. So we are jumping ahead more than a decade. Let me find the cover of this one. What's this here? So this is one of the ones where the cover was very Christmassy and I think this is a November, December. Yeah, this is November, December 87. And so it seems to me like sometimes they did the double month issue in the summer. And then it seems like sometimes they did it for November, December. But it makes sense to me that, putting something very Christmassy looking on the front, they're getting to that place. Whereas the earlier issues, maybe not. Okay. So this one is a little thing called Quilt Lovers Forum. And so I guess, they accepted articles from people that were just writing these little blurbs. So it says, this month's forum has a quilt maker from Stowe, Ohio at the podium. She is writing to express her views about quilt sales. Her name is Mary Beth Siplinsky. It's Cieplinski. Siplinsky. So, quilt sales. I am becoming more and more alarmed by the lack of professional workmanship seen at quilt sales. Okay, she's the one who's she's going to rail about a few things. I am not talking about old quilts found at garage sales and flea markets. Imperfections that appear in antique quilts just seem to reassure us that quilters all through the ages have had the same problems, making their points meet or keeping their stars smooth. However, I don't understand the reasoning behind selling a quilt at current prices, no matter what level of workmanship is present. Looking down your nose at some quilters, eh? There was a quilt show and sale in a neighboring town recently that was very well attended. The quilts were beautiful, plentiful, and imaginative. The attached prices were not quite as beautiful, but they adequately reflected the amount of work that goes into the making of a future heirloom. Unfortunately, the prices were decided according to the size of the quilt and had nothing to do with the quality of workmanship. Imagine my surprise to discover a small wall hanging made of a pre-printed panel with borders added, having the same price tag as a completely hand-pieced and quilted wall hanging. Yeah, that would bother me too. My amazement over this particular lowering of standards was nothing compared to my shock when I found a price of more than $400 on an 8-pointed star quilt where absolutely none of the centers met. I don't mean that they were a little bit off, as so many of us have had happen. Not one of the centers came anywhere near meeting. Near is italicized. There was also a Star of Bethlehem quilt with raw edges sticking out in the middle. I took the cowardly way out and said nothing about my outrage to the sponsors of the sale, but I came away with a very uneasy feeling about how non quilters must view these high priced examples of the quilter's art. How can any self respecting organization justify publicly exhibiting such obviously poor specimens alongside true masterpieces, especially when the show was loudly advertised to be composed of the most currently popular style of quilts done by professionals? The inclusion of these quilts only served to cast suspicion on the rest of the sale pieces. As a longtime quilter with my own share of dogs, I have a few quilts I've made that are total dogs. I can forgive a bit of a wobble or a small amount of pucker in an otherwise lovely quilt. But to my way of thinking, the job of educating the public about the value and collectability of quilts is going to be just that much more difficult as long as the price tag is unrelated to the workmanship. Well, Mary Beth. In some ways, I agree. I mean, should a quilt that was maybe made by a beginner be placed there beside a master quilter and, you know, ask the same price, ask for the same selling price? Absolutely not. And I have to kind of wonder, like, newer quilters, um, I'm not saying they shouldn't give their quilts as gifts or try to sell their quilts, but I think that there's that kind of quality assurance in, putting your work out there and kind of doing the best work. And, you know, if you've made a few quilts, you've made a crummy quilt. I can tell you that. Now we all know those people that are like, I want to make a quilt. I've never sewed before. I'm going to make a quilt. And they pick the most difficult thing and they execute it flawlessly. And then you want to kill them because you're like, how dare you? How dare you be excellent right out of the gate? But those type of people, even though we know them, they are very few and far between. I think most quilters do kind of make a little bit of garbage before they get good and they get that practice in. And I guess the question is, like, what should happen to those quilts? Um, some of my dogs, and now I'm not saying that my some of the quilts I've made that they were poorly made. Because I do try my best to, you know, I don't do raw edge. You know, I don't make a whole lot of things where points need to meet, but when I do, I try to, I take it apart if the points don't meet. Um, but what I have done with those is I've cut them up and made other things. And I kind of, as an artist, I kind of have that, that's a thing I can do without it seeming odd. Now, I know people that maybe are, in quilting, not for gallery shows, but, rather, the fineness of quilts, maybe won't want to do that. But, I go back to, like, what would you do? What do you do with your first attempts that maybe aren't great? Um, I mean, I sort of think it's like, keep them around as an example. Um, and you guys might remember, and I know I showed it here on my stream. Jill and I also showed them over on Quilt Nerding, but some of the study quilts from the AQSG quilt study this year. We have a biennial quilt study, and one of my absolute favorite, um, and the topic was quilts. It's 1940s to 1970s quilters and designers. One person, Madge Ziegler, she recreated something she made in the 70s. I think it was her very first quilt. And it was, she talked about, and I think she had a picture of it there. And she just talked about how, it was just not good. Like her stitches were big, her applique wasn't good. Um, things didn't necessarily quite meet up perfectly. And so she took that, she kind of redesigned a little bit and she made it today, 2025, 2024, 2025. And of course, it looks fantastic. I mean, that is an example of a person who, over a 50-year time period, has quilted and practiced and, honed her skills to the point where she, could qualify in that higher level. In terms of master quilter, I don't know how you get a title like that. I mean, I don't know. There may be some organization that bestows that, like AQS or something. But anyway, very talented, very good. And I think that's the kind of thing that we have to think about. Um, so let's see. Um, Druid says they will still keep you warm. Yes. I think that they become utilitarian. You know, you put them on the bed, you let the dog sleep on them, you throw them out in the yard when the kids are playing outside. You know, they can lay down under a tree on the quilt. You know, I mean, I think that's kind of what we do with those, and they should be. They're utilitarian. They should be used up. Those are the quilts I think that deserve to be used, used hard, washed, and loved, even if they look horrible. Um, so Robin says there are some mismatched corners points that I'll rip out and redo. Others I leave because sometimes close enough is good enough. Yes, also true. I would say that's my theory about points. When I do make something that has points, close enough is good enough. If it's really bad, if it's really causing issues with the construction, I'll pull it out. But yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about. All right, how are we doing on time? We are obviously not going to get to the Patchwork Girl of Oz. Let me ask you guys this. Were you enjoying the Patchwork Girl of Oz? Was it a bad choice on my part? My intention was to kind of read through it quickly, end by Christmas, and obviously that didn't happen. We're barely, like, not even halfway through. What I was thinking is I might just record a reading marathon, and if you guys really want to hear it, you can just watch that video, and maybe we'll move on to a different book here as of January 1st. You guys let me know. Chime in and let me know. So let us go back. So Theo Essen, or Eason, I don't think it's in this one. Yes, Theo, I think her name is pronounced Essen, Eson, Essen. She's writing from the, like, early. This is issue number 31. She's writing very early. Druid doesn't like it. Yeah, I just feel like it's cute. It's a cute story. She's a patchwork girl. That's kind of where I was going with it, but yeah, I'm sort of champing at the bit to get back to some, like, the quilty stuff. I think I've got 3 books in the hopper now. We've got hey Quiltish, it is so good to see you. Happy holidays. Forgetting to log on. Well, I know things are busy at the end of the year. But yeah, I think that kind of Druid's comment kind of makes up my mind for me. I'll just do a reading marathon for anybody that was kind of interested in that, and I'll just upload it as a video that you can listen to if you would like. Yeah. All right. I want to read Grandma's Corner, Theo Essen. So we're moving back to, this is the May 72. So let me find that one for ya. What is this one? And I've read you guys some Theo Essen stuff before. So Grandma's Corner, The Last Day of School by Theo Essen. I remember how, as children, we were always voting on which was the best day of the year. Strangely enough, the favorite day changed with its imminence, depending on whether Christmas, Easter, or the 4th of July were in the immediate offing. I guess, however, if we had to settle for one best day, it would have to be the last day of school. The high point, peak, pinnacle of the year at our country school was the day that ushered in the summer break. The buildup of excitement was almost unbearable. Ignored was the sad knowledge that we wouldn't see many a well-known chum until school started again in the fall, or that even fateful changes like moving away or even death might occur during the ensuing months. For now, the prize was the last day of school. Commencement Day, I never could reconcile commencement with the last day, was a community affair almost as important as a county fair. For us, it always meant a complete new outfit from dress to shoes. White, of course. Oh my God, white. If you were graduating from the 8th grade. I could still remember the heady feeling of walking into school in new clothes, freshly bathed, hair curled at the unheard hour of 10 o'clock, carrying a bowl of potato salad and 12 ham salad sandwiches. My best friend Sally was bringing sweet pickles and deviled eggs. All of this sounds very good. Someone else is bringing lemonade, and still someone else a cake. Several freezers of ice cream, the 8th grade boys department, the 8th grade boys department were being readied for the supper when all the parents would be there. There was never any formal classes on the last day of school. In the morning, there were games and races and volleyball contests. Now, this always makes me think, so it's not necessarily the last day of school, but like in the last weeks of school, how many of you had like field day or your kids had field day? That is something that, I kind of always thought was sort of like maybe of something of the Gen X era, but it seems to me here that she's talking about, games and races and volleyball like that. That seems to be the kind of thing that we were doing with field day. So that concept must go back much longer than, yeah, Druid had field day. Druid and I are about the same age, so we were experiencing it. Seems like it goes back much farther than I expected. At noon, the classes scattered to various pre-picked shady spots on the school grounds, with 8th graders getting to go down to the road to a grove along the irrigation ditch without even a chaperone. There were more games and competition in the afternoon. Marianne, you did not a fight. Robin and Quilters both did. Okay. So I guess field day is something that, we've like modern American public education, I guess, has always had a field day. I suspect that they do it because the kids are so like humming with energy for summer to start that they're like, all right, let's have a whole day where these kids wear themselves out. I did not love field day. I'm not I'm not athletically competitive because I'm not athletically inclined. So I could do a 3-legged race or a tug of war, but the foot races and whatnot, no thank you. Parents began drifting in during the late afternoon to view the exhibits of class accomplishments. Classroom walls were covered with pressed leaves, flowers, penmanship exercises, beautifully executed maps, and sewing exhibits. Prominent citizens of the community, usually members of the school board, were asked to serve as judges and present the awards for excellence of workmanship. More often than not, the judges were also the donors of the prizes. Oh, that's interesting. I could still remember the excitement the time I won a $5 gold piece for my quilt sample, and the catastrophic uproar when it was discovered that it had been given through mistake to another girl who had promptly left for home, taking my award with her. I believe I would be trotting along to that girl's home and be like, give me my winnings. The last day of school was concluded by an all-school program, which was preceded by a potluck supper. By early evening, the schoolyard was full of horses and buggies and wagons. So I'm guessing Theo Essen, and I, again, because I don't have a full run of Quilters newsletter and Quilters newsletter magazine. I don't know when Theo started writing and when she stopped writing. But based on the stories, it seems like her grandmother was like pioneer woman. So she's talking about horses and buggies and wagons. So, this is like turn of the century kind of time period, I guess, is what we're talking about here. Quilters, your modern quilt guild has a field day. It's called Sewviver, and we play sewing games outside. Oh my gosh, that is so funny. I love that. All right, so the Canadian quilters are doing some cool stuff. Sewviver. Oh my gosh, that is hilarious. The excitement among the kids was at fever pitch. Remembering back, I'm appalled at how wild we were. We were absolutely drunk from so much unbridled freedom, racing like wild savages up and down the stairs and in and out of doors. I can't imagine how the poor teachers ever corralled us and calmed us down for the evening performance. I'm sure we were a pretty bedraggled copy of our morning starchiness by then. I mean, you're going to dress these kids up in white and then send them to like play all day. The programs were murderously long, since each class and almost every child had to speak a piece or sing a song. All of this before the final proud and tearful presentation of the graduating 8th graders. But going home was the best part of the day. Worn-out kids snuggled in the wagon bed filled with sweet-smelling hay that was covered with good old attic quilts. Their cozy warmth was welcome as we lay on our backs and dreamed over the beautiful excitement of the day. I could still remember how the wagon jolted over the ruts in the road and the strange, disoriented feeling when the horses and wagon would turn at a section lane, and the weird shadows cast by the trees in the light of the lantern that sat on the seat beside Grandma. But the stars overhead seemed close enough to touch, and the friendly moon traveled right along with us, stopping each time the horses did. Whenever we kids would get too quiet, Grandma would sternly admonish, "Now stay awake until we get home." But we could never quite make it, and the torture of stumbling briefly into a dark house, hunting for lamps, and groggily climbing the stairs to fall blissfully into bed was the perfect end to the best day of the year. I like that. That was very cute. Let me see. I don't remember let's see if this 1973 issue had a Theo Essen. Yes. Okay. So by issue 50, oh no, so this one was earlier. So 31 was earlier. So by issue 31, she was definitely writing. And let's see, issue 20. Let's see if she's in here. Yep. So by issue 20, she's in here. This is a very short one. So yeah, so issue 20 is the first one I have. So I'm wondering if she was writing here since the very beginning. Why don't I read it? Because she's talking about a crazy quilt. All right. So this one is June 1971. It is this issue with Nixon's quilt on the front. Grandma's Corner by Theo Essen. Waste not, want not, Grandma was fond of saying. There were no ecology problems in her day. Everything had a use, and if possible, a reuse. But thrift only accounted in part for the bright bits of beautiful fabric that she salvaged for her crazy quilts. Grandma loved beautiful things, but she never felt that a beautiful thing was too good to be used. That is why I was always puzzled as to why she kept an especially lovely and elaborately embroidered crazy quilt folded away in her treasure trunk. Occasionally, she would take it out, and together we would exclaim over and caress the lovely bits of silk, satin, ribbon, and velvet, so intricately pieced into a riot of beauty. So if we think about crazy quilts having this peak in the 1880s, certainly there were some made earlier. They were made up into the 20th century, but if we had to guess, Theo's grandmother would have maybe been a mother, a young woman, something in the 1880s. So how does that math work out? Yeah, maybe. Like, let's say if Theo Essen's grandmother was like 40 years old in the 1880s, then she would be in her 60s at the turn of the century. And, you know, like an accurate, appropriate grandma age? I don't know. Okay. Grandma always seemed to grow a little sad when she looked at the quilt. Invariably, she would sigh and fold it back into the trunk. Once, as I grew older, I suggested it would look nice on the couch in the parlor, that special room reserved for Sunday company. No, dear, she said firmly. There is too much sadness and too many unhappy stories built into this poor quilt. Oh, think about the crazy quilt in the book that we read, the Mystery of the Crazy Quilt. A lot of sadness in that quilt. Let's see. Someday when you're older, I will tell you about it. And with that, I had to be content. I was almost a grown woman before I finally heard the story behind Grandma's quilt. As a very young girl, she lived in a raw, new western mining town. Because of her nimble-witted fingers, she was apprenticed to the town dressmaker. Oh, you guys are going to love this. Because of her nimble-witted fingers, she was apprenticed to the town dressmaker, whose best-paying clients were the fancy ladies. Grandma's polite term for the town's prostitutes. So her grandmother worked for a dressmaker for prostitutes. For the most part, they were generous, warm, and witty women and girls, especially Sissy, short for Cecilia, I think. Because she was so young, we used to talk and laugh a lot when she was being fitted. Those girls always had the very best, and were they ever particular about a perfect fit. But Sissy would bring me small presents, and she would see to it that I got all the leftover scraps from their lovely dresses. Once she even gave me a small gold brooch for a Christmas present because she said she couldn't give it to her own little sister. Even after all those years, a tear slipped from Grandma's eye. That was the Christmas they found Sissy dead, with a strange bottle gripped in her hand. Well, now we have a mystery. I made up the quilt for my hope chest, but somehow, after I was so happily married, I never quite wanted to be reminded of Sissy. I have kept it to put away all these years. I'm sorry, I have kept it put away all these years. Grandma finished her story, sighed, and folded the quilt away again. Just recently, I gave the lovely, never used quilt to the State Historical Society together with its story. It will be used as a bed cover in one of the old pioneer homes being restored by the Society in the very town where the quilt's story was started. So that is interesting. I mean, I guess if you think about it, like, the sex workers of the early pioneer towns, I mean, unfortunately, they were kind of like a necessary sort of thing. You know, you've got all of these men going west. I mean, certainly after the Civil War, lots of people went west, but the gold rush, what is that, like 1849? The 49ers, right? And women were not always necessarily making that trek. You know, sometimes it was just the men going ahead with the plan to bring the rest of their family, or maybe going ahead to seek their fortune and come back east, whatever. So, you know, without their family, you know, men will be men. um, you know, these women, these fancy ladies were there. It never occurred to me though that they would have been like very like finely dressed. Um, you know, that they would have the best clothes. But I guess if you think about, you know, some of the like the courtesans that you see like in European period pieces, um, they were dressed very nicely. The brothels and such, those women were dressed very nicely, and I guess that was really about attracting men to pay them, you know, for their services. So I mean, it makes sense. Um, and that's kind of interesting. I mean, I guess you think about, we see so many quilts, you know, these older quilts, and I'm studying one right now that is a crazy quilt, and it was made by a woman who was a milliner. And I've told you guys a little bit about this quilt. I think I've showed you a picture of it. But she was a milliner. So it is clear to me that so much of the material in this quilt, there are actually ribbons, and some of these finer pieces of silk that are probably like hat liners, and such. So there's like a clear, like sort of, I mean, not a provenance, but it's clear to me where these fabrics come from. But we see other ones where we kind of suppose that, you know, maybe this woman was a dressmaker because she has so many different fabrics and they're fine fabrics. Or maybe she was very wealthy and, you know, she and all of her girlfriends had many frocks and they traded the scraps. Um, or, you know, maybe they had a father that worked in, like, say, a printer, you know, a printing mill, and they were able to get like offcuts. And so they had all these fabrics. So we think about those sort of scenarios in how a woman might construct a quilt that has, you know, all of these beautiful fine fabrics in it, and like, where'd she get them? Because, you know, people that they didn't have the local quilt shop, they didn't have unlimited resources to just go and buy, you know, the whole like every colorway of this new line. You know, they had to build these collections up. But it never occurred to me that one might make a quilt from the fabrics of, and I mean, this is a dressmaker's story essentially, so it's not all that much different. But the fact that this was not like the town mantua maker, but rather the woman whose clients, best paying clients, were the sex workers in the town. I mean, just think about that. Look at this, like this big picture. I mean, however you feel about people who make their money this way, aside from the fact it's kind of it was considered maybe necessary, consider the economics of this town. You have women that are serving this purpose and they're making their money this way and they're probably making good money. And then they in turn are keeping the dressmaker of the town in business. And then in such a way that she's wealthy enough or successful enough that she can hire an assistant. And then that assistant can then make quilts with all of these pieces. I mean, it just, it's kind of an interesting thing to look at, like in how all of these people, kind of relied on each other, I think is what I'm kind of looking for. All right. Well, that was an interesting one. All right. Let us read this one, and this will probably be the last one. And I'm so sorry we kind of got cut off today because of my electricity going out. Make sure, yeah. Okay, so this one this is the December of 73 one. Let me put that back up to gaze at. And I'm so interested to know if Theo Essen was writing from the very beginning, because there are only 19 issues from this first one I have, so I'm gonna have to find that out. Okay, so here we're back at December 1973. Grandma's Corner by Theo Essen. This one's called The Greater Gift. So I think this is going to be a Christmas story. It never nears Christmas that I don't remember the night the stranger came to our door. It was the night before Christmas Eve. The evening had started with an icy, sleeting rain, but as I opened the door to a different knock, I was thrilled to see large, fluffy flakes filling the air. I remember thinking happily, it will be a white Christmas after all. But my excitement at the weather was suddenly gone as I became aware of the plight of the poor creature standing in the wintry dark. He was so thin and blue with cold, it was hard to tell his age. He might have been 40 or even 60. A shapeless felt hat dripped cascades of water onto the shoulders of a thin coat that was little more than a suit coat. It was stretched over two shirts, probably worn for warmth, and also probably all he owned, since his only luggage was a small canvas bag that was woefully thin of content. At the sight of me, he doffed his hat with a blue bare hand and said from stiff lips, "Good evening, miss. Is there someone I could ask about sleeping in your barn tonight?" It was suddenly comforting to realize Grandma was at my shoulder. "Good heavens, Dodie, ask the man to come in." So I think Theo Essen's nickname or family name was Dodie. I remember reading that in one of her stories. Without further ado, she was propelling him toward the glowing base burner in the dining room, where we were about to gather for our supper of hearty vegetable soup and apple dumplings with cream. "Quick, Dodie, set another place," said Grandma. As I flew to the pantry for more dishes, I heard the man protest. "Please, ma'am, don't bother. I just need a few minutes. I need to warm a few minutes." As I turned, I saw him stagger slightly and reach for a chair. "The heat feels so wonderful," he said as he sank, or more rightly collapsed, into the chair. Grandma took a second look at his cracked, soggy shoes and saturated clothing and took charge with her usual vigor. "Mister, you've got to get out of those clothes before you come down with pneumonia. Here, drink this hot coffee while I rustle you up a change." She disappeared into the front bedroom and, in a few minutes, came back and handed the stranger a wash basin of warm water and a heavy towel. "You'll find dry clothing on the bed, but first give yourself a good rub down to stir your circulation. We'll wait supper for you." Our farm was more than 2 miles from the nearest rail line. We children had heard the word tramp spoken darkly, but never before had we had a stranger seek asylum. But any fear we might have felt was dispelled by pity for the thin, quiet stranger and our feeling of excitement at the incident. It seemed only a short time when the man came out of the bedroom, looking strange in some of Grandpa's clothing. Extra chairs and a drying rack were set up behind the base burner and near the kitchen range, and the man's poor clothes were hung to dry. Then we gathered around the table, blessed the food, and ate. We were all a little ill at ease. It was hard to talk to the stranger, since he only volunteered that he was going home for Christmas from the gold fields. He ate with restraint, even though we were certain his meals had been sparse and few between. I was dying to ask questions, but under Grandma's eagle eye, I knew I did not dare. The food and the warmth got to the weary man, and he sat nodding by the stove for a long time, long enough so that his clothes had become quite dry, even his cracked shoes. As he dozed, we noticed that he often fondled a watch chain, minus a watch, from which dangled a large, strangely shaped blob of gold, which I later learned was called a gold sprout. Even child that I was, I somehow knew that this was his only material possession. Suddenly he wakened from his relaxed sleep in agitated embarrassment. Ma'am, please forgive me for imposing on your hospitality. I'll take my things, and if I may, I'd appreciate sleeping in the barn just for tonight. I was sure that Grandma was going to insist that the stranger sleep in the house, but instead she quietly said, "You are more than welcome to sleep in the hay. You will find a canvas cover in the loft. Dodie, run upstairs and bring down one of the woolen attic quilts, and John, light a lantern for the gentleman." The man looked relieved and grateful. "I'll be careful with the lantern, ma'am," as if he said as if anticipating the unspoken warning of all the farm folk about fire. I scurried upstairs to the cold bedroom and reached for one of the heavy woolen attic quilts that we kept for winter use. Then, for some reason, I put it back and pulled one from the bottom of the stack. One that I knew was well worn, and one whose corner had been turned under and mended because it had been chewed and shredded by an ambitious family of mice. For just a moment, I felt small and mean. Then I assured myself, it really is quite good enough for a tramp. When I got back to the kitchen, Grandma was still scurrying around. She handed the stranger a pair of gloves and a worn but warm sweater, and a sack that I was sure contained food. "You will find a pair of overboots in the feed bin in the barn. There will be snow on the ground in the morning. I'd be happy if you would wear the boots. Good night and safe traveling, sir." From the window, I watched him go. The lantern made strange and monstrous shadows in the dark. I couldn't quite understand why, but I felt the man walked toward the barn with an air of dignity. The next morning, the snow was inches deep, white and unmarred. Our stranger must have left very early, since there were no footprints to mark his departure. We soon forgot our unusual overnight quest in the excitement over our first major snowfall. Eagerly, we set out for the barn and our early morning chores. It was strange how the gleaming gold chain leaped at me from where it hung on a nail just inside the barn door. I grabbed the chain and ran back to the house to show it to Grandma. "Look," I blurted, "the poor man must have forgotten his watch chain." For just a moment, Grandma looked sad. Then she smiled. "No, dear, I don't think he forgot it. I think he wanted us to have it. I think he was saying thank you to us for the one thing that meant the most to him. I'm sorry, with the one thing that meant the most to him." Suddenly, I remembered my pettiness about the quilt last night. I told the whole story to Grandma. She put her arms around my shoulders and said, "I'm sure he slept just as warmly, dear, but I'm sure you will always remember that his was the greater gift." Oh my God. Oh, that makes me cry. Ah! You hear those stories of like the people, during the Depression, and I guess earlier. I suspect this was probably earlier than the Depression era here in the States. But you hear these stories and like they're touching because they're people that are like truly down on their luck. Um, and they do their best to, like, if they're given charity, they do their best to give it back in some way, in whatever way they can. And certainly I think there are people like that still today, but often we see people that are kind of, looking for handouts without, much in return, giving much in return. So it is interesting culturally. I think we've changed. And, I think that there's lots of people today that could benefit from a handout, but they are too proud to ask, or to put themselves in any kind of situation where, people would see that they need something. So I don't know. Stories like those are kind of always like, pound at my heart and make me think, like, are there times when I've been unkind, maybe to a person who is down on their luck? And, I think about, there have been times when I've helped people and I feel good about that. But yeah, I think there are times when I probably could have been a better person. And, something to think about. So Truett said, "Thank God I was afraid she was going to let him scooch right in with one of the girls." I think there are limits to grandma's generosity. You know, give him some food, give him some warm boots, you know, let him dry his clothes out, sleep in the barn, but certainly you're not going to bunk down with the children. Of course, you also hear horrible stories about, you know, the family let the, you know, let the hobo sleep inside and then like the whole family was murdered. You know? In fact, I think Lizzie Borden, I think one of the stories about who really killed her father and stepmother was that there was some like, you know, tramp, hobo, drifter kind of person in town that they were trying to blame it, you know, blame it on that person, him. So in some ways we are smarter today, and I think in other ways we are not. So, well, you guys, today was a little bit oddball because of my power loss, but happy end of 2025. I hope you guys have a great week. If you follow me and Jill, we will be on tomorrow, Quilt Nerding on YouTube, 7 p.m. Eastern.